I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Karen Hammernas, Director of Education Research and Evaluation at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Dr. Hammernas is a leading scholar in the field of teacher education with expertise in international comparative research and the connection between teachers' personal vision and classroom practice. And we are here because Karen is a former student of Lee Shulman at Stanford. She worked closely with him on multiple projects and publications. She was part of the faculty of STEP, the teacher education program Shulman helped build at Stanford. And in today's conversation, we'll explore how Professor Shulman's idea have shaped Dr. Hammernas' own path as a researcher and an educator, and what lessons she believes are most important to carry out forward in today's changing educational landscape. Hi, Karen. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to have the chance to reflect about Lee's impact.
Thank you so much. So let's start with at the beginning. How did you first come to work with Lee Shulman at Stanford? What was it like to be a student of the great Lee Shulman?
I met Lee actually before I became a doctoral student. I was working with Howard Gardner at Harvard's Project Zero, which is an organization focused on creativity and the arts, and had a project called Teaching for Understanding that I had been part of part of that project. And Howard Gardner had put together a conference of all the leading education scholars in the country to come together as kind of part of a sort of an advisory board for the work. And he'd invited me to come as a, newly minted research assistant to basically be there and kind of document the conversations and to be, in a way, just sort of recording the big ideas that emerged out of the conference. And I ended up sitting at a table with Lee. And I remember just being very excited just to be there, to be in the presence of all these amazing, dynamic thinkers, and not really expecting to interact with anyone. And in fact, I didn't interact with very many of the scholars, but I remember Lee stood out as the person who really made such an effort to get to know me as a student. He leaned over, he started looking at my notes, he asked me what I was doing, then he began kind of probing about what my goals were as a researcher and, what I was interested in studying and, how I was connected to the work. And he made me feel so recognized, even as this, young person who really was not part of the field yet in that way. And he really stood out. And so that was in fact, my very first meeting with him. And then when I applied for graduate school, I mentioned that I had met him in my letter. And so the next spring, I got a call on my, phone. This was way before iPhones. Hi, Karen, it's Lee Shulman. I'd like to invite you to be a doctoral student at Stanford. And I just was so thrilled again that he, it felt like he knew me. He, made me feel important. He was joking about how he was competing with Howard for doctoral students, but he also made me feel so recognized as a scholar, even in, my very early stages of my career. So I think it sort of captures the generosity and the focus of Lee on his students.
So you worked with Lee on several of the basic concepts that later on transformed the teaching profession, such as pedagogical content knowledge and others. How do you see this kind of work that you started back then evolving today?
Well, I think in so many ways, and it's interesting. I'm in a kind of an unusual position. I'm not in a typical tenured academic position where I'm teaching courses about teaching and teacher knowledge. I'm not, working in teacher education directly as much as I'm guiding the research agenda around teaching and learning across an entire public institution that's focused on science. And even in a setting that is not particularly traditionally academic, the big ideas that he developed and named and identified have shaped the research agenda here and continue to impact conversations beyond academia. So the notion of pedagogical content knowledge, the kind of ability of teachers and the need for teachers to develop knowledge that is around teaching their content, not just the content knowledge itself, but the pedagogical content knowledge, actually changed how we develop our programs here at the museum. So we not only have programs that are teaching science content, but we're teaching courses that help teachers develop pedagogical content knowledge around teaching particular things like climate change or genetics and genomics and genethics. So we're developing these courses, and people are sort of tossing around terms like pedagogical content knowledge with familiarity. And so to have the kind of impact that goes way beyond academics and filters into all kinds of educational and learning environments like my own, it really speaks to the power and the impact and the tremendous reach of his ideas. And I find that so exciting to sort of hear people, that I wouldn't know would be familiar with these ideas still to this day, using them to shape their thinking, their programmatic work, and their talk about teaching.
I think we must dive a bit into what you do today at the museum, because many of our viewers are teachers in a school classroom, and they notice that there are such institutions as natural history museums where kids and their parents, and sometimes they come to visit and become inspired with the exhibits. But behind the scenes, there is a research and education agenda, and actually educational opportunities for them as well. So what are you really doing there? How is it something that is beyond a one-time visit to explore a museum? What kind of educational content is being offered to educators?
So many long-term in-depth programs for teachers and for children and for visitors and families. So we have a teacher education program at the museum, a Master of Arts in Teaching. We prepare earth science teachers to teach middle and high school earth science, and primarily in New York City, but nationally. We have programs for teachers that help support them learn to teach science in deeper and stronger ways, particularly around in relationship to culturally responsive teaching, to the next generation science standards. So we reach about 800 teachers every year who come to us for these long-term programs. So they're not many of these kind of drop-in one-time workshops, but they're really, reflective of work that Lee talked about. You prepare novice teachers and they need to continue to develop and deepen their knowledge over time. These are programs that the museum has that really reflect the idea that teachers learn over the course of their entire careers. We have online programs for teachers to come to learn about specific topics. We have a new program that helps teachers learn to teach about climate change, for instance. And then we have programs where teachers can actually bring their children to the museum and learn about a scientific phenomenon, like what would the world be like without insects? And they come for the whole week with their teachers, and educators in our education department model scientific teaching practices and kind of co-teach with teachers from all around New York City. And then the children actually spend a week at the museum.
And that's part of I remember you telling me, I think it was called Urban Advantage, or
Yes.
the effort of public institutions that have some connection to education, try and bring in the teachers and the kids from the city, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we're one of 8 institutions that prepares teachers to kind of strengthen their science teaching practices. Right. And it's now reaching down to elementary teachers. So we work with elementary and middle school teachers all over the city, and we work in partnership with 8 other institutions and the Department of Education. So my job is actually to study the impact of these programs and to look at how teachers are learning in these various programs and how families are learning and what children are learning and what teachers are learning. So my research agenda is, trying to understand the impact of these learning experiences for teachers.
And so it goes a lot beyond the night in the museum, as they say.
That's a great tagline for us. We should grab that.
So let's get back to your academic research. I remember at ARA conferences, seeing you leading a group of scholars who are focused on teacher education, on preparing teachers, novice teachers across cultures, from Europe, from Western Europe, Eastern Europe. I remember from South America, from the US, of course. And looking back at the basic concepts of the core practices of teaching, and looking after a comparative study of how these efforts are being performed in various countries, do you see a common thread emerging? Can we focus on a profession moving forward together?
I mean, I think many of the things that Lee predicted and emphasized in his work, the idea that teachers have knowledge, that knowledge is built over time, that we need to understand different phases of teacher learning over time. His kind of deep attention to novice teacher learning as kind of a window. I just talked about this recently at a keynote in Iceland. This notion that Lee had of like looking at the learning of novices as really providing a deep window into teacher learning over time as a way to really understand sort of how does learning happen? What are the big ideas and foundational ideas that new teachers need to learn? And then how do those develop over the course of their careers is such a foundational idea. And, even as it's foundational and, he named and talked about these ideas a number of years ago, they still feel fresh and important when I share them with others. So, folks who are listening to my talk in Reykjavik thought, and we're responding with great sort of appreciation as teachers to hear that their knowledge was recognized and appreciated as important, that people knew and understood that they needed to learn over the course of their careers and that they did learn and they were learning. These ideas are just so essential to the kind of field of supporting teachers and for growing the profession.
So you were mentioning Iceland and Reykjavik, and recently there is a piece coming from the OECD pointing interested people to see what Iceland has been doing in terms of bringing in new teachers into the profession, because the world is experiencing a challenge in attracting talent into teaching, and probably Iceland, with the small scale and the ability to move quickly, has been doing some positive work on this. Do you see the profession also being challenged today by politics, by the post-COVID effect of, in the workplaces, and all those ideas of transforming American teaching, so to speak, from a blue collar to an expert-based profession? All these efforts being challenged today by developments, by technologies, by public support and trust and so forth. Do you see that also?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on every level, and all of the big ideas that you pointed to are challenges for the profession. The kind of rise of AI and the questions around the roles of teachers, the shortages of teachers, the sort of lack of trust, which kind of skyrocketed during early COVID when parents began to appreciate how much teachers did when they were able to kind of listen in on teachers' work through sort of the necessity of online teaching and learning and sort of teachers moving their classes online. But the kind of trust and the appreciation of teachers has dropped. And I think, we're seeing fewer people applying to teacher education programs in the United States. Internationally, there are shortages. As you mentioned, Iceland, that's a big concern around, kind of supporting teachers and the lack of enough people applying for positions in teaching. And I think it's deeply tied to the importance of appreciating what teachers do, to understanding the nature of teaching as a profession, the vision of teachers as having knowledge, as needing to develop over time, as taking on new and important roles, as being sort of named, developing deep skill and really sophisticated professional knowledge. There's not necessarily, in many countries, although there are a few, where you can really see an explicit acknowledgement of teachers' growth and teachers' learning over time. So it's a challenging environment right now for teachers and teaching.
If today your daughter or son or a close friend would ask you whether to take upon themselves the mission and the challenge of becoming a teacher, what would you recommend? Is it a worthwhile effort, a worthy one?
Well, I have one child at least who's in teaching right now. I still believe that it is one of the most noble and fulfilling professions. And I think my I would never steer anybody away from teaching. I would encourage people to look for school environments that reflect a vision of teaching that allow you to develop over time, that provide professional support, that provide acknowledgement for growth and learning, and that support community and collective and collaboration sort of across the environment. So I think it's really important to look for those features in schools. And I think that will really matter in terms of being able to stay in the profession and feeling like you're appreciated, valued, recognized, and you have chances for growth.
Our final question for today would be about the one thing that you recall from Lee's influence on your life and on your career path that you take with you for the years to come. What's the one memory that you think was so influential on you?
One thing.
Well, maybe two.
Maybe two. I mean, absolutely his intellectual contributions. And I'm not even sure I could sort of name all of them or pick one, because so many of them, what is this a case of? The notion of pedagogical content knowledge, the notion of learning as being public and communal, these kind of big ideas, the importance of learning from others and looking for the smartest people in the room and spending time with them and being humble. Like all those things, those intellectual ideas are essential, and I kind of couldn't tease them apart. But I would say that actually the way that he conducted himself as a scholar in terms of mentoring and support and relational work has impacted me profoundly. And just one anecdote around that. I was at a mentoring institute last week through the National Association of Research on Science Teaching. And they have, every other year, they have a mentoring institute where you're invited. And I served as a mentor. And one of the organizers of the institute said to me that he remembered me being at a conference with him 7 years ago and spending a lot of time with him and walking back from the hotel and treating him like such a scholar. And he said he felt so appreciated and valued, and he remembered that. And I thought back to my own memory of Lee treating me in that way back at Harvard at Project Zero as a young scholar. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm sort of giving that forward. It was like, I feel very moved by describing this, but I said to him, I think Lee would be so thrilled to hear me have done that for you. And it was such a beautiful moment. And I think that's the main thing that I remember, that I will take away from Lee, is his pure generosity and love for other people like that. That just stands out.
Actually, that's very emotional, and I can see how you just defined the core concept of what education really means. Thank you so much, Karen, for being with us and for sharing your insights and memories and thoughts. Thank you.
Absolutely.